Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2 and the 7th mission of the US Marine campaign. In the last two missions we destroyed Syrian blocking positions on Highway 3, we're now past the city of Tal Khalak and running into another one. This time things are a little different. The weather has taken a turn for the worst, grounding most coalition aircraft. With the air threat significantly diminished, the Syrians are looking to take advantage. According to the briefing, a force from the 10th Mechanized Division, with support from the 11th Tank Division, is heading west along Highway 3 in what appears to be an attempt at a major counterattack. This force is going to advance through the town of Khurbat-tin-Navar and run into the lead marine elements on a very hazy early morning. We have a chunky map to fight over this time, about 2 kilometers square, but again the highway serves to split it into sections. Facing east from the marine map edge, the entire map essentially slopes down from left to right. Left of the highway we have a large hill tipped by point 580. This offers good views over most of the map, poor visibility excepted, but critically the convex nature of the slope masks the actual highway. Right of the highway, the ground is much lower, forming a lumpy depression with the highway to the left and higher ground on the Marine and Syrian map edges, in particular Hill 548 on the Syrian side. All of this ground is farmland, mostly made up of good-sized irregular fields surrounded by berms, though there are some orchards, particularly at either end of the highway. All of this is supported by a scattering of farms, marked Farms 1 through 9, and broken up by two wadis, Wadi A and Wadi B. These are nowhere near as impressive as the wadi in the last mission, and are for the most part not impassable, but they still present an obstacle to be taken into consideration. Wadi A begins below point 580 and crosses the highway before turning east and flowing into Wadi B. Wadi B itself spans the entire map and skirts the eastern base of Hill 580 before straightening out once it flows under the highway. The far side of the map features the edge of Khurbat-tin-Navar, which we can split into 3 sections. Closest to the highway we have one housing block, which is Objective Tarawa. Further along, across a secondary road and slightly elevated, we have another block, Objective Saipan. Then up in the far left corner we have a couple of mid-sized building clusters surrounded by orchards. This is not tremendously complex terrain, but there is a lot of it, and thanks to the objectives, the Marines are probably going to have to tackle it all. The aforementioned objectives Tarawa and Saipan are both worth 300 victory points. We also have phase line Hue City, about 2/3 of the way up the map, worth 100, and a limit of advance Tripoli, which is essentially the far map edge, worth 200. Thankfully, these are all touch objectives and I just have to reach rather than clear them. Also on the table are 200 points for inflicting 70% losses on the enemy, and 50 points for keeping more than half my force alive, which is a pretty disturbing metric. On top of all this, we also have to contend with a preserve objective. The briefing indicates that all buildings should be assumed to be occupied by civilians, and we should positively identify targets before engaging them. To tackle these objectives, the Marines have assembled a mechanized force and dubbed it Task Force Razor. Starting off on the map are elements of the LAR and CAAT platoons in LAVs and Humvees respectively, plus one of the sniper squads. Following them up is a tank platoon at the 10-minute mark, and 2 platoons from Echo Company in AAVs will arrive after 15 minutes. Trailing a good way behind and arriving an hour into the scenario are the forward command elements of Beach Landing Team 2-6. In support we have a platoon of medium mortars and a section of 155mm howitzers. The enemy is templated to have a force of infantry and ATGMs out in front, screening the armoured attack down the highway, plus mechanised infantry with tank support in Khurbat-tin-Navar itself. Throwing all of this together, what's concerning me going into this mission is the tension between the objectives and the situation. The outlined situation implies that a significant enemy force will be attacking. The actual mission in the briefing is to advance to contact in order to fix and destroy enemy armour and mechanised units preparing to attack friendly forces. The objectives, however, are heavily weighted towards crossing the map, not destroying the enemy. These are naturally not mutually exclusive, but they demand different approaches. To destroy the enemy attacking down the highway, I want to hang back out of range and sight of any supporting elements on Hill 548 or in the town. To punch up and hit the touch objectives, I want to minimise my exposure by either advancing through the low ground on the right or around point 580, trying to compartmentalise the map and only deal with small sections at once. I also have a pretty small reinforced company-sized force, so I'm not confident I can do both, especially when my infantry is rolling around in fragile AAVs. So this is going to be interesting. There are, again, 2 hours on the clock, so I should have plenty of time, but how useful that time is will be entirely dependent on when the enemy main effort makes its move and how fast I can neutralise it. If it comes in early and impales itself on TOWs and Abrams, then I should have time to switch over to the offensive. If it's late and I stay put, then I'm burning time I will need to advance. If it's late and I've already moved forward, I could end up caught in a bad position. So, we'll see. Either way, the first thing I want to do is get across the highway onto the left, where I can take advantage of Hill 580. Clearing out farms 4, 1, 3 and 2 will create a relatively safe area where my force is in position to both ambush the highway and advance on the town, whilst being shielded by the ground from potential enemy positions at the far end of the map. From there, I should have options. The blue deployment zone in the bottom right corner is screened from the rest of the map by a couple of berms that offer solid hull down positions. So the first thing I do on starting out is get the LAVs and tow Humvees up to the closest berm in order to take advantage of their thermal images. Down at ground level, it's clear that we're going to be fighting in a thick fog or sandstorm, which suits me right down to the ground. Spots quickly start coming in, a T-72AV in front of Objective Saipan, and a couple of BMP 1Ps on the right. The tow Humvees engage them in short order, knocking out the tank and one of the BMPs. While that's going on, I start fanning out. The scouts and snipers head towards Farm 4 to make sure that's clear, while the Humvees pair up and move left. Crossing the highway without any problems, they start to close in on Farm 1. This seems empty, right up to the 15th minute when a Syrian team hidden in one of the buildings shoots the gunner out of one of the Humvees. The next gunner gets it as well before the driver realises he needs to back away. I had the LAV platoon HQ moving in on the building at the same time and they take a casualty as well. I have firepower on hand to deal with this. A Mark 19 lays into the offending Syrians immediately, and I'm able to suppress it with 50 caliber fire the next turn. With the enemy's heads down, I punch the scouts in to mop them up. It's more of an annoyance than anything else, a small tripwire team, but I only have a small force for this mission, and even if I'm confident I can count on bringing overwhelming firepower to bear and ultimately winning any engagement, I don't want to be blundering from ambush to ambush. By now, the Abrams and Echo Company elements have arrived, so I at least have the manpower to get stuck in. It seems unlikely that a single Syrian team would be lurking around in Farm 1, so I bring up an AAV and send 3rd Squad 1st Platoon to clear it out. But the rest of Farm 1, like Farm 4 back across the highway, turns out to be empty. Farms 2 and 3, up the hillside, are not. The dismounted crew of one of the Humvees takes a few pot shots from Farm 3 that turn out to be from an AT-4 team. The fact that this hasn't engaged, despite having line of sight over the berms where I've set up my Abrams and TOWs, is pretty encouraging. It looks like the Merc is seriously degrading Syrian spotting. It's not degrading my spotting though, as the AT-4 discovers when they get hit by a couple of 120mm heat rounds. An ATGM team does indicate they could be more resistant at Farms 2 and 3, so I send over another couple of AAVs with 1st Platoon's 1st Squad and some supporting elements. They don't have a bad run into the farms, able to dismount in a dip in the ground and safely advance across an open field screened by a berm, which will itself make for a good enough base of fire position. Before they're in place though, I get some tank contacts on the far left. There are 2 T-72AVs up on the wide ridge leading to point 580. I assume they've moved up there in the last few minutes because I've had eyes on that area since the start of the game, but they can see down the slope over farms 2 and 3 and completely dominate the approaches. Luckily, they aren't the terms T variants with thermal sight, so I'm able to scuttle my recon elements and AAVs into cover while my deployment zone base of fire engages. The first T-72 is taken out by a tow to the side, but the other one proves remarkably lucky. I fed both of Echo Company's Javelin teams into the firing line and they both get missiles off, and both miss. It does happen from time to time. Javelin is damn good, but it's not totally foolproof. It looks like the final descent stage was a little bit too high in both cases, but a third missile is on the money. I hastily start rotating the Javelin teams back to the AAVs to get more missiles. I'm still waiting on that Syrian counterattack, and when it comes I want to have maximum overkill. Those two T-72s were evidently not the counterattack though. With no more tank contacts appearing, I can get on with tackling farms 2 and 3. The 1st Marines up to the berm, spot a BMP-1 at farm 2, immediately spam all of their AT weapons at it, and miss with all 3. Luckily, the BMP is facing the wrong way. I don't exactly want to get into a shooting match with it, especially not when the threat of RPGs in the surrounding buildings is making me reluctant to send any vehicles up. So instead, it's time for 1st Platoon's small team to shine. Taking over at the berm from the team that missed, they show them how it's done, and despite taking a little fire from a building on their left, they blap the BMP before turning their attention to the offending building and smacking that with a thermobaric rocket. That's not quite enough to wipe the enemy out, but as the turns go on and small arms fire flies back and forth, I'm confident that the Syrians at farms 2 and 3 would have used any RPGs they had by now. Bringing one of the AAVs up to the berm to turn its Mark 19 on the leftmost house conclusively shuts the enemy up. Leapfrogging 3rd Squad up from Farm 1 to tackle Farm 2, I send a team from 1st Squad out from the berm to probe Farm 3. There's a vehicle sound contact on the other side of the building the AT-4 was set up in, plus another infantry contact in there somewhere. The vehicle is a 2nd BMP. One of 3rd Squad's fire teams makes the spot as it reaches the berm on the left and proceeds to knock it out. Putting all of this together, 2 BMPs, 3 small lightly armed teams and an ATGM adds up to a Syrian recon platoon. So on the plus side, there's probably only a 4-man command team left to deal with in Farm 3. On the negative side, I have much bigger problems developing elsewhere. As I've been closing in on Farm 3, a pair of T-72 AVs have left Objective Saipan. Moving past the burning wreck of the T-72 knocked out there earlier, they get spotted by one of the tow Humvees, but it loses control of its missile and it ploughs into a field. One of the restocked Javelin teams takes up the slack, knocking one out, but the survivor pushes on until the tow Humvee has reloaded and gets a missile on target. It seems like another little armoured interlude, a bit like the 2 tanks on the hill earlier, but as more T-72s start to come over Hill 580, it's clear that this is something bigger. All this time, I've been working on the background assumption that the Syrians would attack literally down the highway, as if they were on their morning commute. Instead, they've used the mass of the hill to close the distance. I'm not sure if they're planning to punch through and exit the map on my left, but I'm not in as good a position to deal with them as I would like. Specifically, my anti-tank assets, the Abrams, TOWs and Javelins, are all set up in the bottom right corner of the map, and the assets I would least like to be directly in the way of a major enemy armoured element, my recon and half my infantry, are committed to farms 2 and 3. This isn't as bad as I'm making out. My base of fire can sweep the entire near slope of Hill 580, but at this distance, in this heavy haze, there's a real danger they won't spot targets fast enough. The Abrams open proceedings by nailing a T-72 in the centre, then follow up that success by savaging the advancing Syrian tanks. One running behind the first kill actually survives their first hit, but a second knocks it out. Another on the far left gets almost level with the farms before being punctured, and a sneaky T-72 running along the highway gets spotted and taken out as it rides up on a berm. My AAVs down at the farm pop smoke and desperately try to bug out into the dead ground further down the slope, while the Marine dismounts, hunker down and stand by with s'mores and disposable AT. TOW and Javelin knock out another 2 tanks up on the ridge next turn. Again, thanks to the spotting differential and the weather conditions, the Syrians never got a shot off. It's not fair, but as long as I'm in distribution rather than receiving, that's fine. Ironically, there are some BMPs trailing the tank company who do manage to get a shot off. I've hastily sent one of the javelin teams across the highway to Farm 1, where they're a bit closer to the hillside and can cover the sneaky path down the edge of the road. While the first BMP goes down to a tow, the javelin team spots another all the way back in objective Tarawa, getting a missile away that attracts a 73mm round from a much closer BMP coming over the slope right in front of them. It doesn't last long though. Seemingly woken up, the Abrams wipe the advancing BMPs out with their 120mm guns, while the javelin missile drops onto the distant enemy IFV. That was presumably the Syrian counterattack, and, somewhat as anticipated, it came at an awkward time. If I had been moving faster and had had my force on the way up to or on top of Hill 580, I could have had to face down all that armour from a much more dangerous position. So on the one hand, it's a good thing I wasn't moving faster, but at the same time, we're now 50 minutes in, and that leaves only 70 to punch all the way up the map and touch objectives Tarawa, Saipan and Tripoli. Trying to get a move on, I start pushing the recon elements uphill again. From point 580, they should be able to see out over the reverse slope and the edge of Covert Tin Navar. This is, of course, a two-way street. One of the Humvees proves to be not quite hull down enough and eats an ATGM from the far left corner orchard with fatal consequences. The culprit turns out to be another BMP-1P. So there are more Syrians to worry about, and they're not completely blind. Pulling the HMG and GMG Humvees back from the crest, I swap them for the LAV platoon dismounts and soon bring up the LAVs themselves, along with one of the tow Humvees and a javelin team to get some thermals online and maximise my sensor overmatch. They can also reach out and touch things too, starting to pick off more BMPs as they spot them. This is all good, but I really don't have time to peel the onion like I usually do now that we're halfway through the battle, especially when the javelin team picks up an enemy infantry contact just down the slope on the left. Slow, steady and methodical isn't going to cut it here. I need to force my way forward, even though that may mean playing the Syrians' defensive game. With BMPs in the back line and infantry out in front to try and fix my force exposed near the crest, they've again got a pretty solid defensive setup. Unfortunately for them, I've got a load of angry Marines with armour support. Dropped off by an AAV behind the crest, I send 2nd Squad 1st Platoon forward to make contact and fix the enemy infantry, while I bring an Abrams pair up on the left to support and send some of the LAV scouts down the slope through some dead ground to get on the Syrians' flank. 2nd Squad comes under fire, the Abrams blast the contacts, in between sniping BMPs in depth, and the enemy draws back from their positions along a tree-lined berm where they're taken under fire in the flank by the scouts. With the Abrams not suffering any incoming fire, I risk bringing an AAV into the firing line to get stuck in with its Mark 19, which really turns the tables. The enemy infantry break and flee, with 3rd Squad coming online as well. The Marines follow up and finish them off. While all this is going on, a minor crisis develops way back in my deployment zone. I've been gradually transferring forces out over the highway to stage in the dead ground in front of Farms 2 and 3. That way they're in a better position to support the fight on Hill 580 if that's necessary. As the sun rises though, it appears that the Syrians can see into my backline. I don't know whether this is from some FO with magical sightlines way back in the town, or if the crew of a Syrian HQ tank managed to bail out with a radio, but they start calling in artillery on the edge of my deployment zone. The 2 2nd Platoon AAVs set to make the crossing next are just going off as the fire mission comes in and they get away, but in the last few minutes, the BLT-26 Forward Command Group has arrived. This consists of a single 3-man HQ team led by the Lieutenant Colonel commanding the Beach Landing team, who has evidently decided to stay close to the fighting to get his finger Spitzengefühl going. What he actually gets is a near miss from what's probably a 120mm mortar. Luckily it lands just behind his Humvee, and although the whole team is slightly injured, none of them become casualties. Their vehicle is a write-off though, and they bail out into the enemy mortars, which is obviously just perfect. He's exactly the kind of high-value target the enemy would love to obliterate. Luckily, the Echo Company Command AAV is still hanging around the deployment zone, and I send it over to pick them up and get them some more protection before bugging out. The HQ's radio operator is winged by shrapnel as he goes for the ramp, but the Lieutenant Colonel makes it. With that little interlude sorted out, I can get back to the Marine Infantry now probing down the far side of Hill 580. Getting to the berm at the far end of the field, defended by the Syrian infantry, 2nd Squad hears some engine noise in the dip on the other side. Creeping up the berm, they spot another BMP lurking in the dead ground. They immediately blow it away, panicking a second, which I'm able to polish off when the next fire team arrives with more AT weapons. Further towards the centre, still with the accompanying destruction of every BMP that gets spotted in the town, the LAV dismounts are dealing with a bailed out vehicle crew in front of Farm 7. I'm going to need to clear Farm 7 in order to push on to Saipan, Tarawa and Tripoli, so after some mopping up, the berm in front becomes my next firing position. Soon, both LAVs and Abrams and elements of 2nd Squad are set up to cover the scouts as they move downslope towards the farm. Halfway, they pause for a moment to mop up a Syrian crewman hiding in the field, which evidently marks them out for an enemy RPG team on the roof of a building in Saipan. They get a rocket off, which thankfully misses, and the Abrams on Overwatch gives them a 120mm heat round in return. I had somewhat been hoping that objectives Saipan and Tarawa might not be defended, or that the enemy would react to the relentless attrition of his vehicles by surrendering, but no such luck. The scouts have at least crossed phase line Hue City, and it quickly becomes apparent that Farm 7 is clear, leaving me the final half hour to concentrate on the problem of reaching the touch objectives up ahead. The challenge here is that both Saipan and Tarawa are pretty dense, complex urban areas that I'm increasingly certain are infested by enemy infantry. I might be feeling pretty good about the number of BMP kills I'm still racking up on the edge of town, but a reasonable extrapolation of a squad of dismounts per BMP adds up to at least a company's worth of Syrian infantry to deal with. Even though I don't need to totally clear these objectives, I still need to reach them, and the open fields outside Saipan and Tarawa aren't places I want to go with either infantry or vehicles if the buildings ahead are crawling with RPGs and PKMs. From my positions on Hill 580 and around Farm 7, my options are pretty limited. I could potentially swing left and hook into Saipan from that flank, but that would mean clearing out all the orchards and buildings over there. Going right is even worse, as I'd have to move across the front of the whole enemy position and close the range with whatever the Syrians have over on Hill 548 in the upper right corner, which incidentally includes at least one ATGM team that knocks out the tow Humvee near point 580 while I'm not paying attention. But there is one avenue of attack that looks promising. Beyond Farm 7, the ground slopes down into Wadi B. The wadi is wide and deep enough to provide a covered approach right up to a secondary road that runs between Saipan and Tarawa and exits the map by crossing a limit of advanced Tripoli. I only have time to mount a single attack here. If I punch up this road, I'll be able to touch all three objectives. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Although the approach might be the easiest, the actual space between Saipan and Tarawa is a textbook ambush position. There are a lot of compounds on either side, and those in Saipan have the high ground. It's not a good place to be. I don't think I have time to try anything else though. The Humvees and LAVs probe a way forward through the wadi, attracting fire from rooftops in both objectives. The Abrams back at Farm 7 and up the hill retaliate, and soon I've remounted 3rd Squad 1st Platoon into an AAV and brought them up. They don't take any fire as they edge out from the wadi, which is encouraging, but doesn't necessarily mean that the road ahead isn't a death trap. I have got something up my sleeve for that though. I haven't actually used any artillery yet in this battle, and while the ROE prohibits striking buildings without positive identification of targets, it doesn't stop me putting down some smoke. So the 155s start laying a smoke screen to obscure Ambush Alley, as I layer up more forces to cover a dash for the objectives. There are still contacts popping up on the roofs with Tarawa, so I put down a linear barrage of airbursting 81s to discourage them. With the timing between the mortars and the smoke lining up pretty neatly, I scurry a fire team across the road to Tarawa's side and push them up into a drainage ditch to touch that objective area, before bum rushing an LAB straight down the road through the smoke to hit Tripoli. It makes it, supported by a hail of machine gun fire, and pulls back out again before the smoke dissipates. 2 down, just Saipan to go. It proves a tougher prospect though. By the time 1st Squad 1st Platoon is getting into position to lunge for the objective area, the smoke is gone and the mortars have ended. The surviving Syrians tucked into the compounds on either side open up. 1st Squad is caught in an effective fire sack and goes to ground immediately with a couple of casualties. I bring what fire I can to bear, but the most effective enemy fire is coming from keyhold and defiladed positions in Tarawa that I can't engage very well. After toughing it out for a couple of turns to see if I can get that all-important fire superiority, it looks like I'm going to have to invest time in a more methodical attack if I want to get forward and touch objective Saipan. With 3 minutes left, that's not happening, and I'm not throwing more men and vehicles in. 1st Squad disengages, and I let the timer run down. Cease firing instead of waiting through the variable extra time nets the Marines a tactical victory. I've gotten 1900 points for touching phase line Hue City, LOA Tripoli and objective Tarawa, missing out on objective Saipan, whilst retaining 500 points for not levelling every building that looked at me funny, and netting all the points for smashing the enemy, keeping most of my Marines alive, and, something I glossed over when I read the briefing, not splurging more than half of my ammunition. The Syrians, on the other hand, have come away with 896 points. Most of these come from stopping me touching central Kerbet, i.e. objective Saipan, and not getting completely annihilated, though they did pick some points up for taking out 3 Humvees and a whole 29 points for killing the Lieutenant Colonel's radio operator. In terms of casualties overall, I lost 17 Marines dead and wounded, 2 Humvees on top of Hill 580 and the Lieutenant Colonel's Humvee. The Syrians lost 181 men, 11 T-72 AVs, 22 BMP 1Ps and a UAZ Jeep. Looking at the aftermath, picking the most obvious approach into Kerbet Navar in an effort to hit those touch objectives put me in between 2 Syrian mechanized infantry companies, which is definitely the worst tactical position I've been in so far this campaign. A human opponent would have completely ruined my day. Which somewhat brings me back to the mission for this scenario. This was very much a battle of 2 halves, with the second half's ground objectives effectively unlocked by the destruction of the Syrian counterattack in the first half. I was maybe a bit too focused on the counterattack and didn't give myself enough time to hair up the map to tackle the town, but at the same time, I can't help but think that touching Saipan, Tarawa and Tripoli was a serious overextension. There are still significant Syrian forces in the town, and I think setting foot inside the marked objectives is much less meaningful than securing Hill 580, Farm 7 and Wadi B, all of which can be used as jumping off points for a proper clearing operation once the Marine main body catches up. But where's the fun in that? Hope you all enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If you'd like to watch these videos early and support the channel, you can do so on Patreon and via YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.